recovery had kind of stalled, and when we came into office, we had to fix a lot of stuff. You know, organization of government was really kind of dysfunctional at the time, so I kind of restructured how the government was organized in the chain of command, created a recovery office, and really began to make some hard decisions that folks wouldn't make before. We had a little bit of money, and we had a lot of projects, and the money was spread over all these projects, so none of them were fully funded.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, we had about $1.5 billion worth of projects that was city-related, not Corps of Engineers or airport or things of that nature. We had to say, look, we've only got $980 million, so we can spread the money and not finish any of these projects, so we can kind of cut a third of the projects out and fully fund, right, the other two-thirds of them, and that's what we did, because we thought it was really important that we got a lot of the infrastructure rebuilt. So if you've been to the city the last couple of days, you see a lot of newly paved streets, you see a new streetcar line, you see a brand new medical center going up down the street. That's a $3 billion investment. You see a lot of work being done on the sewage and drainage system. You see a huge amount of retail being built in the city right now. That's a consequence of focusing and targeting those resources, but to do that, you have to tell a lot of people no.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always hard to do. So that's one of the things that we did. The other thing that we did is we called the whole city together and said, look, it just can't be the government, faith-based community, the private sector, not-for-profits. Everybody's got to put into the pot, and everybody's got to kind of envision not building the city back the way she was, right? Because the city wasn't in a great spot before Katrina. It had dilapidated schools, it had dilapidated roads, it had a lot of y'all think about what you want the city to look like in 2018, and then start building and designing towards that. And that's what we did. And so you see an entire community that, for the most part, still have problems, but came together and came up with a singular vision for the city and a strategy. And then, most importantly, everybody divided up who was supposed to do what, when, and how, right? And that's what's going on. And so you see it starting to move in that direction, and that's why you feel the new energy in the city right now. Well, let me say it this way without being ungrateful. What people don't want to remember accurately is that Katrina was not a natural disaster for us. We get hurricanes all the time. They come in, they go out, we get wet, it knocks things down, we get dry, and we clean them up. This has happened on the Gulf Coast forever. We have lots of examples, Betsy being one of them, Camille being another. This was a man-made disaster, and what was different about it was that the federal levees that were engineered, designed, and built by the federal government broke. And when that happened, the city flooded. And the city got 17 feet of water, 500,000 homes got hurt, 250,000 got destroyed, 1,700 people were killed. So when people say to us, well, the federal government gave you a lot of money, the technical answer and the real answer is they only gave us about a third of the damage that was caused by the fact that that levees broke. So $126 billion sounds like a lot of money, unless the damage was $300 billion. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in. So in that context, the federal government did send money down here to repair the damage that they created, but it's not enough to put it back the way it was. And so when you have a gap in funding, right, notwithstanding the fact that some came from the federal government, some of it's got to come from the state, some of it's got to come from the local government, and the rest has to come from the taxpayers, or they have to do less. We have private sources as well, but when you add all of that up and you put it in a pot, it doesn't approximate the amount of damage that was done. And so everybody knows this. I mean, with time, money, good leadership, you can fix everything. And if you don't have one of those three things at any time, it takes you longer and you might not get there. Or if you have all three of them and a little bit of each, it takes you longer. And so what you have to do is make sure that you marshal all your resources. You have to focus them. You have to make decisions. You have to set priorities. You have to tell people no. And you have to make sure you're focused on what it is that you want. And the city's doing a much better job of organizing itself around those principles, not fighting so much along racial lines and geographic lines. We're just kind of getting the basics back up and operating. And we're doing pretty well so far, but it's like anything else, we have a long way to go. Yeah, I was elected when I was 27 to the House of Representatives, where I was for 16 years. And then I was elected lieutenant governor of the state, where I served for 6 years. And then I ran for mayor, and 3 years ago assumed this position. The truth is that I just want to stay here. That there's a feeling that we have in New Orleans that Washington doesn't work. It's dysfunctional. that folks that are up there, Republicans, Democrats alike, are way too high and too disconnected from the reality on the ground. And the real governing in America that really matters, that's fun, and that's fulfilling is actually happening on the streets. And mayors are the closest elected officials in the country with real authority and power that are closest to the street. And I think what we're doing here, and there are some other mayors that are doing this around the country, is they're helping America figure out how to fix problems again. And this is a much more exciting place to be. Who knows what the future holds? I can only be the mayor for 8 years, so I don't know where in the world that's going to take me. I'm term limited. But I didn't do this job as a stepping stone to another place. I did this job because this is the one that I've always wanted. And I like it very much. And they're real problems, and they're hard. They're complicated. But, you know, we like to say that New Orleans is going to help America find herself again. And other cities in America can do the same thing. And most innovation is taking place with Republicans and Democratic mayors because they have real problems that they can't run away from. They got to fix them. And there's no excuse if you don't get them done.
Well, perhaps you can be a guide to what we need to do in Memphis and Shelby County. The thing that's going on right now, we haven't had a Katrina, but Memphis and Shelby County have problems that I'm sure you've had here, most cities have these days: declining revenue base, expanding revenue needs. And both the cities...
Well, that's the whole story right there.
Yeah, yeah. And you have that problem. You're facing that.
Yes, absolutely.
Even without Katrina, you would have a problem.
Sure. No question about it. Well, some of that, there are some circumstances in your time of being that you cannot control. So a lot of times I'd like to think about, well, you know, where are we in time and in space? We're in the United States of America. We're in the Deep South. We're not in the Northeast or the West. We're in the third year of the second decade of the 21st century. And the reason that's significant is that we're not in the last decade of the 20th century. What was going on then? Well, the Iraq War ended in 91, 92, around that area. The country was in stable leadership. We weren't in war. The economy was going strong. The stock market was blowing off the charts, and the federal government was in surplus. And President Clinton was in office, and he believed the government had an active role in making things happen. So had Katrina happened in 96, 97, 98, 99, we may have gotten further along much, much quicker because the country would have had a bigger appetite to help. Same thing is certainly true about the Northeast with the recent storm that they had up there and the tepid response. Back in the 70s, when the federal government directed money directly to the cities as opposed to the states, that has changed dramatically, so now the money goes to the states. So where are we now? We're in a country that's got a huge debt. We've got Washington that's dysfunctional. We have a federal government that's not sending money down to local governments anymore. We have states that are saying we're not going to do that either, and basically pushing everything down to the local level, which equals local folks either increasing their taxes or decreasing their services. That's a much different place.
Exactly.
And so as long as, and by the way, the world economy and things that are happening with the European Union are affecting the availability of money that's either coming from the private sector or from the public sector. And so what people are having to do is to find new partnerships that didn't exist before. It's kind of like what you did when you were in kindergarten. When you went to school and when you were hungry, you shared your lunch with other people. You better find some friends that have something that you want, and you better have something that they want, and you better put all your jelly beans in the same jar, and then find creative ways to solve old problems. And in some instances, one of the things that's happening that is predictable is people who have are getting more, and people that don't have continue to get more of less. And that causes, tensions. It causes racial tensions. It causes geographic tensions. And we're going to have to figure that out. I don't think we have the answer to that right now. Here in New Orleans, what we're trying to do is to create the availability of partnerships, space for partnerships that did not exist before. So most everything you see that's working well here is a consequence of federal, state, local money, private sector, not-for-profit, faith-based money, with everybody participating in terms of how much they put in relating to the responsibility and the authority they have. That's a model that's working a little bit better. But at the end of the day, in my opinion, nothing beats, especially for infrastructure, a large amount of money on a project that matters to everybody that comes from a lot of different people a little bit at a time. That is better than trying just to piece together a little bit of money and try to build something that you can't afford, you can't sustain. And how a community figures that out is just part of its growing process that it has to go through.
I watched your State of the City address last week or week before
You
last.
did? You watched the whole thing?
I did.
Oh, my goodness.
I did, and I thought you kept talking about achievements, construction, et cetera, et cetera. I thought a lot is going on in that town. Very rosy outlook for New Orleans. Then you got to the point where you were very candid about crime. Mm-hmm. Crime remains a problem. Apparently, your crime rate is at the top, near the top of major American cities. We're no slouch in that regard either in Memphis. We have a crime issue. We have a technique the police department has called Blue Crush. I don't know if you're familiar with that. They get statistical analysis of where crime is occurring and they concentrate forces there.
Sure.
That has kind of suppressed it somewhat, but it's still an issue. And I know, of course, you had that unfortunate incident over the weekend. What is your strategy for controlling that? Clearly, it takes up a lot of your budget too.
Well, I would say two things. First of all, a city is not all one thing or another. Mm-hmm. Cities are glorious and beautiful and wonderful and authentic, and they're also deep and dark and troubled. Mm-hmm. And there are very few cities in America that are different from that. You may find some, but in any urban area in America, it could be Memphis, it can be Atlanta, mm-hmm. right? It could be New Orleans, it could be Birmingham, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Chicago. Every one of them has an accumulation of good and bad, and a lot of it is on top of each other. Mm-hmm. So the speech that I gave was designed to give an accurate reflection of where New Orleans is in her goodness and in her badness. Actually, the theme of the speech was, let's keep what's good and let's get rid of what's bad, mm-hmm. and let's pray that we have the ability to see the difference between the two. And so it is true that New Orleans is doing really, really well. For the first time in the history of the city, we have the Wall Street Journal, Forbes magazine, the Brookings Institute saying things about us like, it's the fastest growing city in America, it's the best place to do business, it's the hottest spots for entrepreneurs, you can't have more fun and you can't eat better food, and by the way, the people are great. And that is true. That is an accurate assessment. It is also accurate that we have a problem with violence on the streets of New Orleans. Now, you made a comment that I want to correct, because there is a difference, and it's important, at least for us, to know the difference between the two. What is the crime rate, and what is the murder rate? They're both different things. Yeah. So, for example, New Orleans, as it relates to overall crime, is safer than 73 major American cities. Mm-hmm. I think Memphis, I don't want to misstate this, I think Memphis has a higher crime rate than New Orleans. Now, we're talking about rape, robbery, murder, burglary, mm-hmm. things of that nature. Mm-hmm. I believe Memphis's crime rate is higher than ours. However, although y'all have a problem with murder, our murder rate, which is to us a separate and distinct thing for a lot of different reasons, is much higher than Memphis's, higher than Atlanta's, right? And so there are these weird things where in some cities their crime rate is low and their murder rate's high, and in other instances their murder rate lows and their crime rate's high. And I haven't been able to, through our research, find why those things are not correlated. Mm-hmm. So in the city of New Orleans, one of the things we're spending a lot of time on is why the murder rate's so high and who's murdering who. Mm-hmm. And what we've found here, based on our statistics, and I'm willing to bet without even looking that Memphis is not far away from this, that it is generally young African American men killing young African American men who are somehow related by geography, may or may not be in gangs, and are messing around with each other relating to drugs and other kind of relationships. And the cycle of violence goes something like, you disrespected me, or you took my stuff, or you came into my neighborhood, and the way we're going to resolve our differences is by shooting each other in the head and leaving you for somebody else to find. 88% of the people that are shooting themselves in this city know each other, mm-hmm. and are a consequence of retaliatory measures. And we're trying to figure out not just how to stop that, which is what you talked about. So you have Blue Crush. Mm-hmm. We have something called the Group Violence Reduction Strategy. I've got a multi-agency gang unit. When something bad happens, ATF, DEA, FBI, New Orleans Police Department, the U.S. Marshal, everybody converges on that area and tries to apprehend, right, put in jail, and make sure we protect the streets. That's good, and we need to do more of that. We need to get better at it. But if you get into what is the cause of that thing that just happened, you get into a lot of stuff. You get into families, you get into race, you get into education, you get into poverty, you get into jobs, and it's the same thing that's crisscrossing America in a lot of urban centers. And Memphis, I think, shares more characteristics with New Orleans relating to that, but don't feel alone, because it's happening with Mayor Nutter in Philadelphia and Mayor Emanuel in Chicago. And we as mayors have to really think about how to organize our communities to actually look at the hard issues that nobody wants to talk about. And we're talking about them in New Orleans. That's the one thing that may be very different. We're kind of running to the fire on this thing because, in my opinion, it's the thing that you need to fix if the city's ever going to get well, because it's a part of the city that if it's sick, the rest of the city will suffer from it.
One of the big issues nationally these days is the gun issue, for obvious reasons, the Newtown massacre and so forth. I would think that if you have a disproportion between murder and crime rate in general, that guns are largely to blame, because people don't beat each other to death with baseball bats very often, or they don't stab each other to death as often as they shoot each other. What is your response? Do you have any particular approach to the gun issue here?
Well, let me kind of frame it this way. First of all, I believe in the Second Amendment. I think people have a constitutional right to own a firearm. But I also believe that where there's a constitutional right, there's always a corresponding responsibility, and that reasonable and thoughtful restrictions matter. And this is true for every constitutional right: First, Second, Third, Fourth, Fifth Amendment, Eighth Amendment, whatever it is. I think a balanced approach is always the one that the Founding Fathers intended. I don't have any problems whatsoever with the assault weapon ban that was proposed by President Obama. And I'm a little bit disappointed that the NRA changed its position on background checks, because I think most people in America would agree that we want to keep guns out of the hands of criminals and folks that have the level of mental instability that make them dangerous to anybody else. Having said that, I live in the state of Louisiana. There's state statutes that prohibit local governments from enacting things like background checks. And finally, I would say this, notwithstanding the fact that the gun is the instrument, and these individuals, these young men, are using the gun for that purpose. Most of what they concentrated on Washington was the assault weapons ban, but that's only like 1% of our problem. It's mostly illegal handguns in the possession of criminals that shouldn't have them. And we ought to find a way, at least I think, there's got to be some near universal support for the idea of we all ought to do everything we can to keep violent weapons out of the hands of felons who are going to hurt each other. That to me seems like a place where we can find common ground. Now, having said that, I want to also say, but if you did that, and that's all you did, and you didn't get into the issues of babies having babies, dysfunctional family structures, education systems that didn't teach, economies that didn't produce jobs, and the much, much deeper things that cause a young man to pick up a gun and to be so calloused about his life that he has a complete disregard for somebody else's life, then you're really not going to solve the problem. The gun is just the instrument that evokes that dysfunction. And I think that we can't just get stuck on the gun, although I think we ought to concentrate on that. We have to focus on the other stuff, because that is the cause. The gun's just the instrument. And if you just take the gun away, you're not going to stop you might stop the method of violence, but there's going to be another way that plays out. And if you want to have a healthy community, you absolutely want to do the first thing, which is to stop the shooting, but then you want to get to the root cause of it. And I think this nation needs to kind of look back at some of the decisions that we have all collectively made on the conservative side and the liberal side about what we have produced in the last 40 years as it relates to violence. I'm going to give you a number that hopefully will shock you. In the United States of America since 1980, approximately 611,000 lives have been taken through violence on the street. Now, that number is more than all of the American lives that were lost in all of the wars in the entire 20th century.
That's
World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan. If you add all of the American lives lost on all of those battlefields in all of the wars of the 20th century, we have lost more people to gun violence. So when people come talk to me about homeland security and terrorist threats, as dangerous as those are to us, what I notice about that is that when that occurred, we got very emotional, we got very scared, and we found $1 trillion quick, right, and did what we had to do to protect ourselves. But this kind of slow, periodic, relentless death on the streets of America have gone unattended to. We have to attend to that as a country, or we're going to be forever weaker than we should be.
Do you have a different population base than you did before?
Yeah, this is kind of how the numbers work. Back in 1960, we were at about 650,000.
Mm-hmm.
We were bigger than Atlanta, bigger than Houston. So from 1960 to 2005, the population went like this.
Mm-hmm.
So the night before Katrina, we were at about 465.
Uh-huh.
When Katrina hit, everybody got scattered
Right.
to the winds. After Katrina, the population stabilized, at about 320, 330, and then now we're at 360. So 9,000 people moved here last year. That's why Forbes said we're now the fastest growing city in America, because people now are flocking back to the city because they know that we've kind of stopped it from falling off the cliff. We've plugged the financial gap. We've turned her around, and now she's moving in the right direction. And people are now getting really excited about New Orleans' future. They know that this is a troubled place. They know that she's got a lot of challenges, but they also know that it's a pretty good bet. And folks are kind of starting to come back now, and it's a good feeling.
It's based more upscale now than it was before, proportionally?
To a certain extent, because remember, we're counting, let's count apples and apples.
Mm-hmm.
In the city of New Orleans itself, the population is down from 465 to about 360, 100,000. But in the metropolitan area, the 7 or 8, we have parishes, not counties, is pretty much back to where it was before. So when, say, folks moved out, well, they went out to the suburbs. They didn't all come back to the inner city, but now they're starting to move back into the inner city. And that's a good thing. I would say the mix is not a whole lot different from what it was before. The African-American population is 60%, white population is 38%, with 2% other, which is generally made up of a fairly robust Vietnamese community and a Hispanic community as well. So this city is still majority African-American city, as it was before Katrina. The mix is a little bit different because we've had an influx from people, that have not been from here before, and these are really like graduates from MIT, Stanford, folks that have come down here and really gotten excited, decided to stay. And that's where the entrepreneurship and the cultural economy is starting to generate, is because a lot of smart people are coming here and creating stuff that didn't exist before. And more importantly, instead of bringing their culture here, getting completely enveloped in our culture and loving it and deciding to stay.
I don't know if you're following the NBA playoffs. The Memphis Grizzlies are in the second round, have a chance of getting into the conference finals, and then they may have a chance to take on the Miami Heat. I'm not too optimistic about that. The Saints have had some very good years.
Yes.
And this next year may be good. They're off.
They're going to be much better this year. They had a tough year last year.
Yeah. Well, they're on better terms with the commissioner.
Sure.
How important are the Saints to the health of the larger New Orleans community? And what would you say about what the Grizzlies might offer at Memphis?
I would say, in a broader context, cultural and sports institutions that bring people together are really important to the solidarity of a community. Some places have football teams, some have basketball teams, some have both, some have baseball teams, some have major events, cultural events like we have, like with the Jazz Fest. Any major event like that brings people from the area together, where they can see each other and enjoy something together, whether it's a competition or whether they're watching it, is a beautiful thing for the community. And we have a lot of those here. It's one of the things that's really helped New Orleans come back in a cohesive fashion, because everybody saw each other. Remember, we got sent to the winds. We didn't know whether this place was going to survive, and these things brought us back together. So in the Superdome, 70,000 people sitting there. Right at the Jazz Fest, 500,000 people came, and you saw your friends, you saw your neighbors, you knew you had something in common. That was critical. The Saints took that to another level, because the city was so used to losing just in everything, that when the Saints won, it gave us a chance to think that, you know what, we can actually go from worst to best. And they have been a driving force in our ability as a community to come back and visualize ourselves as a successful town. And I would think that the Grizzlies would do the same thing for you. Unfortunately, I think if you hit the Heat, you're going to have a little bit of trouble.
I'm worried about
so I don't want to make y'all feel bad, but that team can play a major role in the community just becoming one and focusing their attention around it. And by the way, some of it has to do with the ownership. The guys that own the Saints, the Bensons, and now the Pelicans, have been great philanthropists and have given back to the community and have asked their players to be a part of that. That's really critical, not just the existence of a team. It's how they act, how they participate, whether they're giving or whether they're taking. And it's not just about winning. It really is about them integrating into the education system, philanthropic community, the recreation departments that you have, and really being a real part of the community. If you have some leaders on those teams that are like that, they'll really help push the city forward.